Greetings and welcome. We are in Junior English, and we now turn to the great Edgar Allan Poe. I'm with you in the hymnals on page 288, 289. I just want to make a couple of quick observations about biography as we now head into this classic short story, The Fall of the House of Usher, a text that will become really important in the history of fiction, short fiction. I want to start though with this guy, Edgar Allan Poe. You could argue maybe the most tragic life lived of almost any writer. Notice how young he dies. Do you see it at the top of 288? Born in 1809, dies in 1849, which obviously makes him 40 years old when he dies. Really, really tragic life he lives. If you just read, for example, some of these headings, you'll see it right away. A troubled childhood. Notice the top of 289. Struggling with little reward. An unhappy ending. There's all kinds of interesting discussions about how Poe dies. Some argue that in the end it probably is as a homeless guy, and there's been some speculation that maybe a rat bit him as he was asleep on the street. Because of some drug use, he lived a tragic life. The way I often will say it, and when I comment on The Raven, I think I say this as well. It seems like, you might want to write this down for Poe, it's a way to tie into this guy's stories. It seems like everyone he ever loved left him, often through death. And one of the ways that Poe, it seems, is able to kind of deal with these losses is to write these Gothic, some of you would call them twisted stories. Let's go ahead really quickly and turn over to page 291. I want to point out under literary analysis on 291 that we're going to be talking about Gothic literature. Now, if you are at all familiar with a fashion movement of the early 21st century, late 20th century called Goth, and for example, someone was dressed as a Goth, this is just simply the abbreviation of the word Gothic. And this comes actually from a genre time period that Poe makes very famous. You can see the list of bullet pointing information. Most of you are familiar with Goth fashion as being predominantly dressed in black and heavily influenced by black eyeliner and the like. Also, a mood towards the melancholy or the lugubrious or sad, downer. Take a look at the bullet pointing work here for Gothic. The setting is going to be bleak and remote. That means in the middle of nowhere. Macabre or violent incidents. You got to have a lot of death if you're going to have Gothic literature. Characters in psychological or physical torment. I would write down the word torment. You got to have some kind of pain involved for it to be Gothic literature. Now, a number of years ago, somebody started making films that they simply called SAW, S-A-W. And for those of you that are all familiar with these films, they are, of course, really detailed texts where lots and lots of pain and torment happens. Yes? These films are in many ways an extrapolation of the kind of work that Poe will do. In almost every one of his stories or poems, we'll look at The Fall of the House of Usher in our junior text, we'll look at the text The Raven, there's always some kind of torment that seems to be happening of two kinds, which is why we want to write it down. The torment can be, yes, it is true, physical torment. We think, for example, of The Pit and the Pendulum, where a poor guy is tied up in a prison cell, and there's a huge hole in the middle of the prison cell, and above him a large axe head swings back and forth, coming closer and closer to him, and he's tied up so he can't leave, when all of a sudden from out of the hole come huge rats. Hundreds and hundreds of rats come up, right? So physical torture is definitely a part of his stories. For those of us who remember from our freshman year, the Cask of Amontillado. This is a story about a guy who gets buried alive way down under the ground in the cellar. He gets buried alive down there. So you have physical torment. But more importantly for our story study is the second kind of torment or pain, and that is psychological or mental torment. So we're going to have that. The other bullet point here is there's got to be some kind of supernatural or otherworldly events which take place. There's got to be strong language full of dangerous meanings, and all of this will be evidenced for us in the fall of the house of Usher. So let's now turn to the text itself. I'm with you on page 292, 293, and this classic story, are you ready for this to write in your notes? This is the classic story about a haunted house. If you'll think about it, every October, when trick-or-treat and Halloween time comes around, it's a fair question to ask, why is there always haunted houses associated with that? I mean, if you'll think about it, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, why is it that a house would be haunted and that would be where people would go to get scared? The correct and quick answer to this, by the way, is this short story. Well, that's not so short, I should point out. This long short story is in many ways the birth of the genre and the notion of the haunted house. A place that has something wrong with it, and from the very beginning, you get a sense there is something wrong with it. Now we're going to turn to the story itself. And if you have done what good readers do, you're going ahead already and you're flipping through the book to just see the number of pages we're talking about. Now, it is true, there's 1 or 2 pages of illustrations here, that is true. But by and large, this is a story of words, and there's going to be a lot of them. And as a reader, it makes sense to at least see this in advance. You got me? So as you start to look at the story, you're already aware this is going to be a story of a few paragraphs. But more importantly now, I want in our notes at 2B, we're going to write this down, to talk about Poe's language or his diction. Poe's language or his diction. And just to introduce this to you, without saying anything else, I just simply want us to look at the opening few words of this story. So I'm with you on page 293. We'll be listening to a professional reader, but I just want to point out what we will talk about when we talk about Poe's dense syntax. Syntax just simply means word order. Poe's dense, in other words, very heavy with words. Take a look as we read together on 293. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. Whoa! Now, hey, as readers, we are evolving. In our junior year, we hear, for example, ourselves say out loud or think, it's time to get ready for the ACT. That will come in the spring of my junior year. It's time to get ready for my senior year, which will then beg the question upon graduation, what will I do and where will I go? And if it's more schooling, we're aware it's going to need to be a level of reading that we probably have not engaged in our freshman or sophomore year of reading. Would you agree with me? When we pick up a text like The Fall of the House of Usher right away, we have to be prepared for the dense syntax of Poe. Dense, heavy. For example, I read 5 or 6 lines to open this story. Notice how many commas there are. Boy, I hope you're paying enough attention that you can at least count up number of commas. Notice we have parenthetical phrases that are, watch my hands, stacked on top of each other, one after the other. Poe likes this style of writing. It forces us to slow down and to reread. It also is going to play rather nicely into the kind of story that he's going to write, which is a scary story. It's a horror story. It's a story about a scary place with scary people there. But notice how the story syntactically begins. I'll look at it again. During the whole of a dull, comma, dark, comma, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, comma, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, comma, I had been passing alone, comma, on horseback, comma, through a singularly dreary tract of country, comma, and at length found myself, comma, as the shades of evening drew on, comma, within view of the melancholy house of Usher, full stop. Whoa! You got to know how to read stuff like this. The first indication that you are into Poe is when you've read several lines and you ask, where's the period? The period is coming, but it's after a series of parenthetical phrases, clauses, that set up the very end. The sentence itself is simply, notice, during the whole of a dark day, I stumbled onto the house of Usher. It takes him 6 lines to be able to say that. I showed up at the house of Usher. Number 2, notice the language of oppression, melancholy. Notice, during the whole of a dull, some of you are writing this down at 2B, dull, dark, soundless day, autumn or fall time of the year when everything is dying. Clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens. I've been passing, notice it, alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country. And at length found myself as the shades of evening drew on in the evening, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. So right away, let's put it in our notes as Poe works to set a certain kind of mood, a certain kind of tone. The mood and the tone will be Gothic. Scary, freaky. We can jump really quickly to 3A and ask this question. What is your favorite scary movie that has to do with a house? That has to do with a house. And some of you will go, wow, you know what? Almost every one of the scary movies that I like have something to do with a house where freaky things happen. It may have to do with the ground the house is built on. It may have to do with other houses that are around it. It may have to do with the town that it's in or the place that it's in. But all of the action seems to take place in a single location, that is, a haunted house. Poe invents this genre. And to him we tribute a whole lot of successive kinds of stories like this. So, the house of Usher has something wrong with it. I'd write that down. The question of the story will be, what's wrong with the house of Usher? Now let's go ahead and say it out loud for your notes. At level 1, the word house can have 2 meanings. The word house can be the physical structure. This mansion that sits in the middle of the woods next to a swampy lake. Ooh, with vines growing down it and nasty trees all around. House can mean the physical structure. But number 2, house can also mean the family of Usher. So the fall of the house of Usher will mean not only quite literally the fall of the physical house, which by the end of our story is going to actually physically fall, but we're also going to have the fall of the family of Usher. And the question will be more particularly, what's wrong with this family? And what's wrong with this person that our narrator goes to visit? I'll give you a hint at level 1. Our narrator goes to visit an old friend. His last name is Usher. And there is something noticeably wrong about him. Right away then, we're working with Plot Hill. We have in our exposition, remember we've spoken of this before, we will have always the introduction of at least 3 things. Characters, setting, and of course time. We're already told that it's the fall, autumn. We're already told it's the evening. And we're already told that he's showing up at the house that belongs to a guy named Usher, a large mansion. The rising action will introduce the conflict. Remember, we have two kinds. Internal, character versus self. External, character versus another character. Character versus a force of nature. Character versus society or an idea. Leading that conflict to a climax at the very top of Plot Hill, and then the falling action. After we finish reading the story, we will want to ask the question about the story's conflict. What is the central conflict? I would write that down right now at 2B, because we're going to ask this question at the end of the story. What is the central conflict to this story? All right? But now, let's go ahead and begin with a reading of the text. We're going to start with a little bit of background. I'm reading with you on 293. Are you reading it with me? In 1839, I'd write that date down. In 1839, Poe lived in Philadelphia and became co-editor in the Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, a journal that published essays, fiction, reviews, poems, as well as articles on sailing, hunting, even the game called cricket. Poe's articles ran the gamut of topics. He explained, for example, in gymnastics, the parallel bars. He mused about the mysteries, for example, of Stonehenge over in England. And he reviewed more than 80 books on varied topics. It was in this magazine that he first published his classic short story, The Fall of the House of Usher. Some people call this his most famous story. Okay? It's a debate which is the most famous story of all of Poe's. Many argue that it's this one because of the implications. Now I want to point out right away that we begin with a two-line quote in French from a famous French writer, and the translation is at the bottom of the page. His heart is a lute strung tight. As soon as one touches it, it resounds. Okay? So we've got opening lines that won't make any sense until you finish reading the entire story. Let's follow it now. The Fall of the House of Usher. I really do challenge you to use the tip of your pen or pencil and see how long you can actually stay focused with this reading. It will not be easy. It is a challenge, but I challenge you nonetheless to do it. Reading Poe will definitely improve your reading ability and definitely improve your ability to take an ACT in your junior year. No doubt about it, because it's pretty demanding. Here we go. The Fall of the House of Usher.
The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe. Son cœur est en lutte suspendu, sitôt qu'on le touche il résonne. During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building, a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I say insufferable, for the feeling was unrelieved by any of that half-pleasurable because poetic sentiment with which the mind usually receives even the sternest natural images of the desolate or terrible. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the mere house and the simple landscape features of the domain, upon the bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees, with an utter depression of soul, which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveler upon opium, the bitter lapse into everyday life, the hideous dropping off of the veil. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought, which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. What was it, I paused to think, what was it that so unnerved me in the contemplation of the house of Usher?
What's wrong with this house?
It was a mystery all insoluble, nor could I grapple with the shadowy fancies that crowded upon me as I pondered. I was forced to fall back upon the unsatisfactory conclusion that, while beyond doubt There are combinations of very simple natural objects which have the power of thus affecting us. Still, the analysis of this power lies among considerations beyond our depth. It was possible, I reflected, that a mere different arrangement of the particulars of the scene, of the details of the picture, would be sufficient to modify, or perhaps to annihilate its capacity for sorrowful impression. And acting upon this idea, I reined my horse to the precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling, and gazed down, but with a shudder even more thrilling than before, upon the remodeled and inverted images of the gray sedge, and the ghastly tree stems, and the vacant and eye-like windows.
Notice now his introduction to the mansion. He says that the windows look like eyes that are staring at you. He comments on the trees being decayed. All of his adjectives are going to emphasize, you might write this down at 2b, all of his adjectives are going to emphasize sadness, melancholy, alone. Let's keep going.
Nevertheless, in this mansion of gloom, I now propose to myself a sojourn of some weeks. Its proprietor, Roderick Usher, had been one of my boon companions in boyhood, but many years had elapsed since our last meeting. A letter, however, had lately reached me in a distant part of the country. A letter from him, which in its wildly importunate nature had admitted of no other than a personal reply. The manuscript gave evidence of nervous agitation. The writer spoke of acute bodily illness, of a mental disorder which oppressed him, and of an earnest desire to see me, as his best and indeed his only personal friend, with a view of attempting by the cheerfulness of my society some alleviation of his malady. It was the manner in which all this and much more was said, it was the apparent heart that went with his request, which allowed